Hi, I'm Nora for eNotes.com and welcome to the video study guide for Othello by William Shakespeare. Is it possible for a man to be more isolated than a black man in a white man's army? Maybe. Make this man not just black but Islamic, at least by birth. Now give him a white wife whose father disapproves. Now set him far from home but also far from active duty so he can't fight or relax. Is that all? No, there's more. Give him a warrior's heart so that when he trusts absolutely. And when he loves with a deep passion. Now let him make one fatal mistake. Let him not realize that one of the men serving under him is out for revenge, boiling with pure evil. Stir all that together and you've got the play Othello, and some hint of why it has stunned audiences for 400 years. You see, the character Othello is a classic warrior, a man of action who could defeat any foe, if he could just find the foe. Instead, Iago, one of the coldest, darkest characters in literature, manipulates Othello until he no longer trusts his beautiful wife Desdemona, a woman who defied her father for him. Iago deceives this great-hearted fool until Othello doesn't just distrust his wife, he kills her, sure that she's cheated on him with Cassio, the young guy who got the promotion Iago wanted. But that's not the worst moment of the play. The worst moments come before Othello kills Desdemona, when he's so consumed by the thought of her infidelity that he essentially goes crazy. And after he's killed her, when it's revealed that she was innocent and loved him completely, oh, the pain. You don't know where to look. Is it more hypnotic to watch Othello fall apart, or to watch Iago ruin almost a dozen lives because he got skipped over for a promotion? Which soul shows us more about being human? I don't know, but if you let yourself think about the question, you'll find yourself watching the play, mesmerized again and again.
Okay, I'm hoping to give you an overview of Othello in terms of the critical readings and approaches that have been applied to it over the past 400 years. And the overview of this discussion will start with Thomas Rimmer. I'm not sure if his name is pronounced Rhymer or Rimmer. I suspect in the 17th century it would have been pronounced as Rimmer. Then we move on to Dr. Johnson before we look at the 19th century critics. And then we move into the 20th century with A.C. Bradley and F.R. Leavis before we look at some of the recent readings of the play. Now, important thing I would like to emphasize here is that this isn't the be-all and end-all. This isn't completely comprehensive. This is a snapshot of some of the key ideas that have come out of Shakespearean criticism over the past 400 years. Beginning with Thomas Rimmer, we see initial criticism being quite negative. The play was seen as unrealistic. Othello was viewed as a jealous booby and said that Iago was too evil to be believed. Now, the first quote I've given you here is really important to consider the values that underpinned the criticism at this time. He says that this may be a caution to all maidens of quality, how without their parents' consent they run away with blackamoors. And so for Thomas Rimmer, Othello is a warning about marrying outside your race. And this is a contentious idea that many critics ever since have disagreed with, although there has been that undercurrent right up until the middle of the 20th century. In fact, Paul Robeson was the first black man to actually play Othello on stage, and that wasn't until the 20th century. Thomas Rimmer is also a bit tongue-in-cheek also, saying that this may be a warning to all good wives that they look well to their linen. And he says that the play is none other than a bloody farce without salt or savour. Thomas Rimmer didn't have much time for Othello as a play, and it's not until we see Dr. Johnson offering his opinions that some positive views are being offered. And so for Dr. Johnson, he looks at the fiery openness of Othello, magnanimous, artless and credulous, boundless in his confidence. And of Iago, he sees a cool malignity and a soft simplicity in Desdemona. Underpinning all of this, Dr. Johnson saw that all of these are such proofs of Shakespeare's skill in human nature, that he sees Othello as an accurate depiction of the soul of humanity. Now moving forward to the 19th century, and we see Samuel Taylor Coleridge giving his views, and he gives us an interesting quote here that's often been used ever since and that's with regard to Iago, that he's driven by motiveless malignity. Iago's motives have been a big question in criticism of the play, in that he's contradicts himself throughout the play, and in the 19th century here we see some explanations for this. But before we get a bit more into Iago, it's interesting to look at what Coleridge says about Othello, that he must not be conceived as a Negro, but as a high and chivalrous Moorish chief. Now this harks back to Thomas Rimmer, in that there's I think a bit of a racist undercurrent here, that somehow in the English imagination it's more acceptable for Desdemona to fall in love with an Arabic appearing Moroccan Moorish chief than it is for a sub-Saharan black man. And indeed throughout the 19th century, Othello on stage was played more with an Arabic appearance than he was with a sub-Saharan black appearance. Coleridge rejects jealousy as a point in his passion. Rather, it's that the one he considered so angelic should be proved impure and worthless. Now, this kind of takes away from the more common interpretations of Othello, that Othello is about a man driven by jealousy to murder his wife. And for Coleridge, it's not jealousy. It's that he loves Desdemona so much, and that he puts her up on this pedestal, that the consideration that she's anything less than perfect is too unthinkable for him. Now, William Hazlitt, around the same time, said that Iago was an extreme instance of diseased intellectual activity with an almost perfect indifference to moral good or evil, or rather with a decided preference for the latter. And this points back to this issue of the motives of Iago. And for Coleridge and Hazlitt, Iago does evil because he is bad. And he's one of these people who is bad by nature, and he gives reasons, or he gives some logical support for his motives, such as his belief that Othello has slept with Emilia, and indeed that Cassio has too. But there's something about the way that the character is written that suggests that this is just a verbal rationalization. His destruction of Othello comes about because he's indifferent to moral good or evil. Now, moving into the 20th century, A.C. Bradley offers some of the most significant criticism of Othello for beginning in the early 20th century. And he rescues the character of Othello as a tragic hero. Up until A.C. Bradley, the character of Othello was well regarded, but he wasn't as seen as great a tragic hero as, say, Hamlet or King Lear. And A.C. Bradley doesn't simply say that he's as good as Hamlet or Lear. He says that he is better. He says that Othello's most famous speeches, if placed side by side with these speeches, an equal number by any other hero, one will not doubt that Othello was the greatest poet of them all. And he says that Othello is, in one sense of the word, by far the most romantic figure among Shakespeare's heroes. And he defends Othello as a victim of Iago's irresistible force. In some of the criticism and some of the readings of Othello prior to Bradley, there's something of a suggestion that Othello's murder is an uncontrollable innate violence in him because he is Moorish, that there's an inner savagery about him. And these racist readings are in line with readings of Merchant of Venice, where throughout its history, Merchant of Venice was seen as an example of the savagery of Jews and the incredulity of Jews. But in the 20th century, we begin to re-look at Merchant of Venice and see Shylock more as a victim of the racism of Venetian society rather than the evildoer. Now, F.R. Leavis is a giant of 20th century criticism. His influence stretched throughout schools and universities, definitely throughout the English-speaking world. And he belongs or follows from this group of critics, or this type of criticism known as the New Criticism in the 20th century. And for the New Critics, there's an emphasis on close reading. They reject any reading of texts that take into account the context of the text or the author's intent, which they call intentional fallacy. They believe in the idea of the literary canon, that there is a list of literary texts that are somehow more pure and greater than all the others. And so in this canon of literature, we would find Dickens, we would find Shakespeare, we would find Christopher Marlowe, we would find Jane Austen. And they believe that great literature offers order and a set of values lacking in society. And so what this brings, what type of criticism this lends to, is looking at text as a self-contained whole, looking at the language and the symbolism as a system that works together to bring out the themes. And so here is a quote drawing on a piece of Leavis's writing about Othello. And he says, "The theme of the tragedy is concentrated in the final speech and action, as it could not have been had Othello learned through suffering. That he should die acting his ideal part is all in the part. The part is manifested here in its rightness and solidity, and the actor as inseparably the man of action." So in this quote here from Leavis, we're looking at the final speech of Othello before he kills himself, and it's purely looking at the speech as a completion of the tragedy. No accounting for Shakespeare's intent or looking at it as an expression of social concerns of the period. Those kinds of readings are completely rejected by the new critics. And it wouldn't be probably until the 60s and 70s that there became a more mainstream criticism that challenged the Leavisite view. And so when we look here, we can see from Germaine Greer a concern for race as a central factor or a central concern in reading Othello. She says, "We no longer feel, as Shakespeare's contemporaries did, the ubiquity of Satan, but Iago is still serviceable to us as an objective correlative of the mindless inventiveness of racist aggression. Iago is still alive and kicking and filling migrants' letterboxes with excrement." But in the first sentence here from Greer, where she talks about we no longer feel as Shakespeare's contemporaries did, immediately there is a concern or a consideration of the values and the circulation of ideas contemporary to the play. This whole quote here would be rejected by F.R. Leavis and his contemporaries. And from Karen Newman, we have Othello is of course the play's hero only within the terms of a white elitist male ethos, and he suffers the generic punishment of tragedy, but he's nevertheless represented as heroic and tragic at a historical moment where the only role blacks played on stage was that of a villain of low status. Again, we see this trend in the latter 20th century towards looking at Othello within the ideological context in which it was produced. And so from that we can see some feminist readings evolving in the 20th century. Some feminist readings examine the misogynistic treatment of women in plays, often pointing to the patriarchal fear of female sexuality. And throughout the play we see a lot of bawdy language used to describe women, particularly by Iago. And this kind of language permeates Shakespeare. We see it in Romeo and Juliet, we see it in Henry IV, we see it throughout his plays. Jacqueline Duzenberg argues that Shakespeare's plays are feminist in sympathy. Now, this is a counterpoint within feminist criticism. There are tensions and disagreements as to the representation of women. Shakespeare, according to Duzenberg, saw men and women as equal in a world which declared them as unequal. He did not divide human nature into masculine and the feminine, but observed in the individual woman or man an infinite variety of union between opposing impulses. He refused to separate their worlds physically, intellectually, or spiritually. We see here a similar sort of discourse here between Duzenberg and Karen Newman, talking about how Shakespeare represented women and represented Othello in ways that went against the grain in the context in which the play was created. Many feminist critics challenge the traditional portrayal of women as simply virtue or vice. Feminist criticism locates the complexity of female characters and their motivations, demonstrating that Desdemona is not a saint, nor Lady Macbeth a monster. What we see in here also is a concern for, or a focus on, Amelia's tolerant practical words in Act 4, Scene 3, which could serve as a manifesto for gender equality. And here she begins with this idea that let husbands know their wives have sense like them. They see and smell and have their palates both for sweet and sour. That those couple of lines there hark back again to Merchant of Venice with Shylock's "hath not a Jew eyes" speech. That basically says we are all fundamentally the same. And this is something that probably explains why Shakespeare continues to be such an important figure in literature. It's not simply that white male academics have put him up on this pedestal. That even in his time, he was writing about equality in a context that was rigidly hierarchical. And Karen Newman again looks at Desdemona as being a bit more complex than she'd been given credit for. That she suffers the conventional fate assigned to the desiring woman. Nevertheless, his representation of her is at once virtuous and desiring, and of her choice in love as heroic rather than demonic dislocates the conventional ideology of gender the play also enacts. So, in the context of the play, Shakespeare, we see, according to Newman, Shakespeare conforms to the conventions of his time. That Desdemona is punished, wrongly, but punished, and that is the punishment for the desiring woman. But somehow he also dislocates that conventional ideology. He breaks against it and goes against the grain. But by making the Black Othello a hero, and by making Desdemona's love for Othello and her transgression of a society's norms for women and choosing him sympathetic, Shakespeare's play stands in contestatory relation to the hegemonic ideologies of race and gender. So these are views of Othello that again go completely against the grain of everything that had come before it. In the 19th century, there's this concern for Othello and Iago's the explanation of Iago's malignity, and then you move forward to F.R. Leavis, only looking at the play in and of itself, to this looking at the play as a rejection or a challenge to the dominant ideologies of 17th century England. And then there are political readings, and there's a lot to be seen here that's quite interesting. That again goes back to the very practice of reading and questioning the values that underpin that. J.W. Lever in 1973 rejects the focus on the tragic hero in favour of concentration on the society in which he exists. For Lever, tragedy is not primarily a treatment of characters with a so-called fatal flaw, whose downfall is brought about by the decree of just, if inscrutable, powers. The fundamental flaw is in the world they inhabit, the political state, the social order. So in Jacobean tragedy, it's not the conduct of the individual, but the society that assails him that stands condemned. And so what Lever here suggests, that would be picked up later by other critics, is that the very act of only looking at plays, at tragedies, in terms of this idea of hamartia or fatal flaw, it prevents readers from actually considering the power structures that exist in the world. And so Jonathan Dollymore asserts that tragedies reveal the political tension of the Jacobean period, particularly by revealing as social, political and historical what prevailing authorities would legitimate as metaphysical. The church and the divine right of kings being challenged by humanism, exemplified by Machiavelli's The Prince. And Dollymore and Sinfield argue that interpreting Shakespeare's villains as studies in evil is a mystification that deflects attention away from the play's comments on the political and social tensions of the period. And so what we see in these later political readings is that the act of only reading tragedies in terms of their genre, or in the new critical Leversite view, prevents readers from engaging with the power structures that exist in the world that constructed the play and continue to exist. So I hope from here you can see some trends in how reading practices have evolved over the last 400 years, and have some snippets there to take into assignments and examinations